They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged Jesus to touch him. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged Jesus to touch him. Now, as I said earlier, introducing this reading, this is not the only healing story in the Bible, not by a long shot. This isn't even the only story about healing the blind. Obviously, there's some symbolic importance to that. But I found this story in Mark compelling, and probably because of the snow. You see, for the last month, really, your staff and lay leadership have tried hard to keep the doors open, to hold actual worship services in the usual way. And 2 times, we failed. One week, there was nowhere to park, kind of like today, but a little bit worse. And then last week, there was a spectacular blizzard. Even today, things aren't back to normal. All month, as we have gotten ready for Sunday services, the Snow Posse kids and numerous adults have had to make numerous plans for many unpredictable eventualities, constantly adjusting, constantly adapting to our new, constantly changing situation. And each time, the plan was different. And each time, we tried to go one way and had to back up and start again. You see, what I find interesting about this story here in Mark is not how miraculous it is, because as a miracle, and you know the miracles in the Bible, there's some pretty impressive ones, it's not that big. What I like about this is that it's like real life. It took Jesus and this man 2 tries to perform a miracle. Can you see anything? Jesus asks. And the man looks at him and says, I can see people, but they're kind of blurry. They look like trees. We all find ourselves in this sort of situation occasionally. We find that we get a little way down the road only to be confused again, only to get stuck one more time. And apparently it happens with miracles too. They aren't all as glorious as the movie version of the Exodus story we heard, where Moses just simply hits the rock and outpours the water that they're looking for. More often, there are fits and starts, at least in our actual lives. And we need something other than a command from God, right? We need something other than anyone's command, really. We need cooperation. We need adaptation. We need personal effort. We need communication and trust. Like an ophthalmologist, or maybe it's an optometrist, I get them confused. Like an eye doctor working with a patient to grind new lenses. Jesus and the man need to work together. They need to communicate. They need to trust. With Jesus asking, what can you see now? Do you need more spit? They needed to make more adjustments before they could move on with the healing and the being healed. And it is this idea of adjustment, of working on a miracle, to try and get it right. It is this idea that helps us to get through Lent. Because Lent is the time for working on miracles. Lent, the church season that began just a few days ago, is about shaking off the cold, about working through the struggles of today to come alive once again. And we see this sentiment in that prayer by Clark Dewey Wells. God of Easter and infrequent spring, he says, lure us to fresh schemes of life, rouse us from tiredness, self-pity, whet us for use, fire us with good passion, restore in us the love of living, bind us to fear and hope again. Here we are called in this prayer to a still distant, yet still guaranteed Easter moment, Easter miracle. And we're called while being fully aware that we haven't really gotten it right in the past, that our vision is still blurry after all this time. But we are also assured, as surely as the seasons change, that we can try and try again. And this is the reason for all the calls and all those churches around the world for taking on some sort of discipline. For practice apparently doesn't get us perfect, but it gets us closer. Now, as liberals, we sometimes have trouble with this idea of practice and discipline, at least in the context of our faith lives. Discipline and practice are things that we understand. We start at a young age cultivating these virtues in youth sports, in school theater productions, in similar institutions like chess and debate club. And then we carry these skills on into our studies and our training and eventually into our professions. Most of us are, in certain areas of our lives, extremely disciplined. And we have seen the rewards that that discipline brings. But when the goal is as vague as some sort of resurrection that we do not understand, even if we look at our lives and see its necessity, when the goal is as vague as some rebirth, it is difficult to find ways to proceed. After all, in our jobs, there are series of tasks, right? We set up our lives with tasks that lead to a goal. Preaching this sermon, for example, requires specific steps at specific times from one Sunday to the next. And it isn't just work that's like that. So much of our lives are like this. Shoveling the walk out in front of the church comes in steps that most of the kids here know by heart. So what do we do? What do we do when that level of specificity doesn't seem to help? When the steps lead toward a religious goal that, as with the blind man, is something we cannot see all that clearly. When we are in the process of gaining clarity for ourselves, it isn't easy always to find a way. During Lent, and in fact at many other times, and you're free to disagree with me, but I don't think you will, we can feel like religion provides us with little more than hoops to jump through. You know what I mean? You can blink, nod, sorry. We jump through these hoops in the hope that something sticks, which is just like the rest of life, or at least those parts of life that we like the least. Clearing the ice dams, digging our way out, hoping that the storms are over. But that's not the kind of religion we have to practice. In fact, I think this year for Lent, we should all do something different. And that is just to stop jumping through those hoops. Instead of finding another thing to do or another task, let's give something up. And I don't mean here giving up in the usual sense, like giving something up for Lent, because that usually involves chocolate. And this winter, no one should be expected to give up chocolate. Instead, we should think in terms of surrender, of letting go. Not of one thing even, but of all those things that hold us down. Not even one specific weight, but all the weights, all the things that separate us from something greater. The Muslims remind us that the word Islam, which we hear a lot in the news, simply means submission. Submission to the divine. Submission to God. And perhaps this is the way we should go this season. Removing the parts of our lives that are not divine. removing the parts of our lives that drive us continually in the direction that we have chosen to call forward, that we have chosen to call progress, so that we can just be present in our world and in our own skins. I like the expression resting in God, says Thich Nhat Hanh in our reading. Resting in God. When you pray, he says, with all your heart, the Holy Spirit is in you. And as you continue to pray, the Holy Spirit continues in you. You do not need to do anything else. Here, as he describes it, prayer, and by extension the spiritual life, isn't an annoying task, an intellectual exercise in conversation with something we aren't quite sure is listening, but instead it is a passive act of mindfulness, a way, in his words, to see things deeply, understand deeply, and love deeply. And this, I find, is the sort of prayer that most of us do best. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I preached a sermon for a couple Snow Posse people, Lee Manuel, and a camera. You can find it on YouTube. And on that sermon, we talked about how the trials of winter have given us the opportunity to surrender to the power of creation, to recognize that we are not in control. And while it may seem counterintuitive, there is power in our ability to do this. For then we can clearly understand our place in things. Then we know how to act. Then we can perceive the open doors and windows and the tracks to take us there. During this time and season, we can make it a practice that will bring us through the winters of life into the spring of our rebirth. So let us now take a moment in silence to think about letting go in the midst of the storm and of the disciplines of mindfulness and trying again.